Okay.
I'm Jim Branscombe, and I grant Monica Richardson permission to use this interview in any fashion she wishes.
Okay, great, thank you.
I sobered up on my own in 1981 after several repeated attempts to get sober. Went through all the withdrawals and everything. But every time I sobered up, it was only a few months until I was drunk again.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know at the time that that's a usual experience of people in trying to overcome addictions, is repeated attempts to quit. And I had a car accident and got in a lot of trouble with the law and the insurance companies and lawsuits. And I made a final decision to quit forever. And that was so much pressure and so many threats of things going wrong. I ended up staying sober only about 27 days, 8 hours and 10 minutes. And you can tell from the precision of that I was actually counting. And I didn't know that I needed to address a whole lot of attitude issues and thinking issues and learning how to handle stress and learning relaxation techniques, some of the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy that we now know in a short period of time people can overcome a lot of dysfunctional thinking and outlooks. And, so when I sobered up for the last time, I wasn't certain I was going to be able to stay sober. There were no people around me except the Baptist minister who, up a little hollow in the Great Smoky Mountains, who I heard had overcome his own drinking by religious conversion. And I worked with Reverend Andy for a long time, but for some reason Reverend Andy's prescription didn't necessarily work for me. So I had a choice between a foot washing, very, very fundamentalist church experience or going to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I figured, even though I knew quite a bit about Alcoholics Anonymous by that time, I figured that was the least of two evils. So I went, and this was in Tennessee. It was a very interesting group. There was no preaching about find a God, and there was no pressure to find a sponsor. There was a group of guys that said basically we think the back of an alcoholic or addict's brain always wants to get high again, and we think the reason Alcoholics Anonymous works is it's a constant reminder for the front of your brain that drinking is not a good idea. And they told me some things that were helpful. I know one of the guys I first met said, Jim, what you need to do is lower your expectations and increase your acceptance. And I learned that, that's decent rational emotive behavioral therapy. And so
Is that what that is?
I used some of those techniques. And I, because I was having so much trouble the first few months of sobriety, I refused to go to a treatment center on the grounds they were going to indoctrinate me into AA and charge me $25,000 for it. So I refused to go, and so the guy suggested I go see a psychologist, and I did that, and he taught me relaxation techniques. He taught me self-hypnosis. Told me that, he thought I had trouble relaxing and too much stress, and that, there's some ways of doing self-forgetting. And he said there's a new book out by a new science fiction horror story writer named Stephen King, and I suggest you go down and get one of his books. So I got,
what year was that?
I got sober on a guy named Stephen King. You get absorbed in Stephen King's novels. And, so that, early on, that was a decent experience. There was a lot of emphasis in Alcoholics Anonymous at the time on how not to take the first drink. Good solid tips on how to stay sober, how to handle drinking situations.
What year was that, Jim?
1981. I've been sober 31 years this year. And I became interested in helping other people who came into the rooms, and I found some of the techniques that I had learned were helpful for other people who had drinking problems. worked with quite a few young guys and were in jail, or in the state of Tennessee they have work camps where people are housed and go out and do public work jobs, and I worked with a lot of those guys, and I found it very rewarding to try to help other people. It gives you some purpose in life. And you know, I didn't get terribly ingrained into some of the cultish aspects of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about it. So there, you know, what aspects of the program did you not like?
Well, from having read the big book when I was 19 years old and a sophomore in college, I was able, because I was raised in a very fundamentalist Southern Baptist background, I could spot that this was Oxford group religion disguised as a treatment for alcoholism. I had read about the Oxford group and knew what they stood for, and I also knew that Reinhold Niebuhr, I took courses on both Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr in college, so I understood why the Oxford group was not regarded as mainline Christian theology. And, so I spotted that in Alcoholics Anonymous. I guess the thing that I was objected most to was Bill Wilson's insistence that character defects were the cause of alcoholism. I was suspicious of that from the start, because if character defects were the cause of alcoholism, then everybody in the world would be an alcoholic. All human beings have the same basic characteristics.
Right. That's a
There's
good
no
point.
such thing as an alcoholic personality. Anybody can become addicted to alcohol or drugs if they consume enough. Some of us are more genetically disposed, the personality disposed maybe, but if character defects were the cause of alcoholism, then I know a whole lot of first-class you-know-whats who should be heavy drinkers, and they abstain. You know,
That's right.
They're
Yeah.
moderate drinkers. So I challenged that several times in meetings and learned that, you know, people in Alcoholics Anonymous tend to say that the words in the big book and the 12 and 12 that Bill Wilson wrote were dictated by God and inviolate and should never be challenged. It was sort of like the fundamentalist in the Southern Baptist Church. Every word in the Bible is correct, even when it conflicts with other parts of the Bible. So I just learned to try to find groups that didn't emphasize those sorts of things. The social aspects at the time, back in the 80s, before the treatment center movement really got
Hold on a second,
rolling.
okay? I just want to go ahead now. So we're talking about the treatment centers in the 80s?
In the early 80s, because of the Hughes Amendment.
What was that?
Hughes Amendment, that was the federal program that launched all the treatment centers. Bill Wilson and Marty Mann went down to Congress in the late 60s and testified for Senator Hughes's bill to provide all sorts of federal aid for treatment centers. And that's what really launched the whole 28-day treatment center program. A whole bunch of the Alcoholics Anonymous members became counselors at treatment centers to spend, 30 days indoctrinating people into the 12 steps. The Minnesota model, Hazelton model of treatment became the standard. And that's when the rooms of AA started filling up with people who were coerced to come to Alcoholics Anonymous.
Really, back then?
Yes.
Really?
That was when people started showing up in buses, and you could tell that these were not people who were motivated necessarily to get sober. They were doing their duty for their spouses or for their children or for, most importantly, for work or for the law enforcement. And Alcoholics Anonymous went from an organization that was there for people who were attracted to it. It became a program of ultimate coercion. And that's gotten worse over the years to the point that virtually everybody that shows up in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous is mandated by the courts or by coming from treatment centers. And AA is increasingly moved away from being an organization focused on transformational spiritual change to an organization focused on spending a whole lot of time trying to persuade people, number one, you are an alcoholic, number two, this is the only way to recover. And I knew this wasn't the only way to recover. I've seen, people in my family who were abusive drinkers like me who made a decision to quit, and they were not dry drunks. They were very happily sober people.
Right.
And so, every time I tried to challenge that, I found the members of AA to be very closed-minded, and insisted that everybody who walked into the room, just because you walked into the room, you were definitely an alcoholic. And the other thing you learn very quickly is that alcoholism is not a category that's very specific. It's not even recognized in medical science. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the psychologists and psychiatrists in America use, it's not a term that's used. It's a layman's term. It didn't even come into existence until the 1840s by a German physician. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual describes two phases of inebriation. One of them is persons who are alcohol abusers. Second category are people who are alcohol dependent. I was alcohol dependent. One of my discoveries in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous was that a lot of the people there are not down and outers. And they're not people that need to spend the rest of their lives attending meetings. And in fact, they're not going to.
Yeah.
So what we have today in Alcoholics Anonymous, I know, is about 2 million people in an organization that's nothing but churn. 60 to 80% of the people in groups today are coerced people. They're sent there by the drug courts, they're sent there by the probation officers, they're sent there by the treatment centers. And I can give you the numbers. In 1993, Alcoholics Anonymous in its membership surveys said there were 2.3 million people. That was at the peak of the treatment center movement. 2.3 million members worldwide, 1.3 million in North America. At that time, the Grapevine, the official AA publication, had 138,000 subscribers. Today, in 2012, Alcoholics Anonymous has only 2 million members. The Grapevine has only 86,000 subscribers and is going broke. And Alcoholics Anonymous, for the past 20 years, every year has sold and survived on selling 1 million big books, to the point that 30 million copies of the big book have been sold, and yet no new members. In the United States alone, we have over 1 million people a year who go through treatment centers. Most of those are alcoholics, not drug addicts. Most of them are alcoholics. That's how the 1 million big books get sold. These people show up, so 1 million a year show up in Alcoholics Anonymous. They get a big book, spend $8 for it as a part of their $25,000 bill from a treatment center, or pay for it themselves because they're sentenced by a judge or probation officer. And yet the membership continues to go down. So if Alcoholics Anonymous had even a 5% retention rate, it would double every 12 years. It's the rule of 72. Divide any number into 72 and it'll tell you how long it takes to double. So 5 into 72, if it was 5%, would be 12 years.
Right.
So from 2003, AA should have had 4.6 million members.
Right.
So the fact that they now have fewer members tells you that this is a churn machine. And Alcoholics Anonymous has one of its central premises that it's an organization of attraction, not promotion. But yet, all of the recruits that are coming in are coerced people, for the most part. That's not to deny that there are people who show up willingly and get sober and have a remarkable life. That happens to some people. But for the most part, we're talking about an organization that has become nothing more than a publishing company with no identifiable leadership, that's become subsumed as a subsidiary of fundamentalist religion in America. So AA has gone from being an organization that's interested in some of the things Bill Wilson was interested in: innovation, finding new ways to treat alcoholics, understanding what helps people make the decision to get sober. It's become an organization of the book. It's become just like the fundamentalist religion people. Every word in the big book and the 12 and 12 was dictated by God to Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, and every word in there is correct. And basically, an organization that had some potential for innovation and learning has become a non-learning organization. Non-learning organizations, by definition, are organizations that are getting ready to go out of business. We know a great deal more about addiction today than we knew in 1935 when AA was founded, in 1939 when the Big Book was written.
There's a line in the Big Book where it says in Chapter 3, science may one day accomplish this, but it hasn't done so yet, which is read in a lot of meetings.
Yeah.
What's different today that you know about that science has discovered than in 1935?
We know today that, number one, unlike the Oxford group, which said we're all powerless over sin and the only solution is God, we know. We know, Bill Wilson just took that and said, you're powerless over alcohol. We know today that addiction is related to brain chemicals and changes in the brain because of addictive substances. We've learned from, for example, from quitting smoking that prescription medications like Chantix can block the receptors in the brain that create the nicotine, and over a short period of time people who've never been able to quit smoking at 5 packs a day can suddenly go to 0. And medications are now available, and there's breakthroughs all the time.
Right. What are some of that they're using right now that are working really well?
The most popular one, and it's had the greatest efficacy with 72 double-blind, state-of-the-art clinical studies, is the Sinclair method. Sinclair method was invented by an American who does research in Finland, and this is a process that's being used very widely in Europe. They take a pill called naltrexone. Naltrexone is an opiate antagonist, and it blocks receptors in the brain. And what Sinclair discovered was that if you continued to drink over a period of 3 to 4 months, and taking the pill 1 hour before drinking, over that period of time, the desire to drink disappears. The craving goes away. You don't have to go through all the withdrawals of alcoholism. And people no longer have a desire to drink. And there's plenty of evidence on the web that does work for people for whom AA and nothing else ever worked. And since then, we've learned some more about it. The U.S., because of Alcoholics Anonymous and because of the 12-step oriented approach at treatment centers, has been very hostile to medication approaches. AA is very hostile to medications. You must have a spiritual experience and find a higher power. And meantime, the medical profession has continued to progress. They've found other substances that help people with withdrawal. Camprol is one of the ones that is effective, in some cases with certain people more effective. Camprol is a drug called Revia, is the brand name. It takes away the cravings, gives people a chance to get some therapy and go on their way. They don't have to spend the rest of their life in recovery in church basements. Another one is Topamax, or chemical name topiramate. All of these, there are many others.
Jim, can you go to your internist? Like you say, someone's very private, and they already know that a woman is drinking too much wine, and can you go to your internist and say, I heard about this naltrexone, and get a prescription for it?
Yes,
Is it expensive?
It's been approved by the Food and Drug Administration since 1994 in America. It's now a generic pill. So it's available at $4 from various pharmacies like Walmart and CVS.
Really?
And whether you use the Sinclair method or just take the pill, it works that way for many people. There's also new forms of naltrexone coming out. There's one called Vivitrol, which is a shot. The people who take Vivitrol shot every 30 days report that they have no cravings for alcohol whatsoever. There's a new form, a chemical modification of naltrexone that's being experimented with now in Germany, called nalmefene, N-A-L-M-E-F-E-N-E. Nalmefene seems to be even more effective than naltrexone, and it probably will be on the market in another year or two. It's in final stages of efficacy testing. So all in all, we are very close to what Bill Wilson wrote about. Science may someday solve this problem. We're getting closer and closer and closer. In Europe, there's much more open-mindedness because AA is not as prevalent.
Right.
In the United States and Great Britain and Canada, because the Hazelden model is predominant, and people are actually encouraged to go off of medications as opposed to taking medications. That was one of the interesting things I noticed when Prozac first came out, that people...
I want to start a new file.
Prozac first came out, I began to notice there were people who would never otherwise been able to quit drinking and alcohol.
Can you just say, I'm so sorry, that just when Prozac first came out, I think I did it off the whole sentence.
When Prozac first came out, I began to notice that the people who had never been able to stay sober before were able to stay sober on Prozac. And then there were better antidepressants, SSRIs that came out, and people who'd never been able to overcome alcohol and drug addiction were able to do so. And that's consistent with what I've come to believe is the basis of a lot of addictions, and that is people are self-medicating mood disorders of one type or another. I was self-medicating depression, and I found that to be true. So one of the things I started doing in the late 80s, early 90s was working with people on health problems and sending everybody I thought that had a characteristics of depression to see a therapist to get a diagnosis. And you know, some of the people who have the most difficulty quitting are those that also have bipolar disorders. When those medications that treat bipolar, Seroquel and Abilify and all of those came out, I began to see that in addition to the folks who managed to quit on antidepressants, there were people who never managed to stop in AA. They were the serial relapsers, were able to stay sober because they finally had a medication that quieted their brain down.
What do you think about the statement in the book where it says alcoholism is a spiritual malady?
It's there's nothing in medicine that describes a spiritual disease. So that's a way of saying the solution is outside of you. And the most effective therapies, double-blind studies have been done on by psychologists and other professions. The most effective methods for teaching people to overcome addiction, how to overcome addiction, is through internal empowerment. The emphasis in Alcoholics Anonymous is find something outside yourself. And it's a bit of a heretical thing. They say, you know, it's a spiritual, not a religious organization, but every group in the world, every night, reads a statement from the Big Book, chapter 5, that says, there is one that has all power, that one is God, may you find him now. That doesn't sound like a non-religious program. And at every meeting in most of the United States, they close with the Lord's Prayer, which is not regarded as a secular prayer, as far as I know.
Right, right. When did you start to see that you really didn't believe in the belief system of Alcoholics Anonymous, and where did you find the information?
I became very interested in finding if there were alternatives, and it was in the late 80s when Jack Trimpe's small book came out.
Why did you want to find an alternative? You were already sober, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of spurred that?
Well, I went to, I sought out groups that weren't as dogmatic, weren't as fundamentalist. I started doing, because I'd learned meditation, I joined a group of younger folks in the New York City area who were doing meditation,
Right.
group meditation, and we all found that tremendously helpful.
Right.
There were many people in that group who were also had discovered that antidepressants would help them stay sober, and they were getting a lot of grief in the rooms because they were taking medications. People telling them, because you're taking meds, you're not a sober individual. And so it became an alternative support group. We met in my house and their homes.
Really?
We went on picnics together. We went on hikes together. So it became, we sort of started our, without even thinking about it, we just started our own alternative to some of the dogmatism and fundamentalism.
Right.
And then I started seeing books coming out that, one of the first books I read that raised doubts in my mind about all the cultish aspects of Alcoholics Anonymous was Nan Robertson's book, Getting Better in Alcoholics Anonymous. She was a member, and she was the first one to disclose that Bill Wilson was a serial 13-stepper, which created incredible turmoil inside Alcoholics Anonymous. Because everybody said it can't possibly be true. This man was a saint. And of course, it's been confirmed since then that Bill Wilson had a mistress that he placed in the editorship of the Grapevine. He left her 10% of his estate in his will. And it's now accepted that this guy was not by any stretch of the imagination a saint. He was the first person to launch predatory behavior in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. So as more and more of those type books came out, more information came out, I started seeing that the basic tenets that in Alcoholics Anonymous were not necessarily correct. On the medication front, somewhere along the line in the 90s, I became aware of Albert Ellis's books and the rational emotive behavioral therapy.
Right.
And strangely, what led me to that was the chapter in the Big Book, third edition, that's titled Doctor, Addict, Alcoholic, where the chapter, page 449, where Dr. Paul O., a member of the fellowship, talks about acceptance and finding peace in your life through some of the techniques. And I learned he'd written 2 books, and I got both copies of those books and started passing them out to people. And it was about changing your thinking. Basically, what Dr. Paul had learned was there's some other techniques, even though he remained a mainstay in Alcoholics Anonymous. He'd learned about cognitive behavioral therapy and other counseling techniques and how to change your thinking in order to change your behavior.
Right.
And so it suddenly dawned on me that a lot of the dogmatic approaches in Alcoholics Anonymous didn't work, and there were other techniques out there. And then, at the suggestion of a friend, because I had a publishing background, because I was a writer, and I was living in Manhattan, a friend suggested that I should go in and apply for a position on the board of a Grapevine, which entitles you to participate in the General Service conferences, and I did that for 4 years. And I was sitting in the General Service conferences saying something doesn't seem right about all of this, and clearly there's nobody in charge. It's a bunch of Bill Wilson worshipers, and he's been turned into a cult figure. The Big Book is revealed prophecy directly from God, and there's no other way to get sober. And I'm sitting there looking at the numbers I just recited to you, that this fellowship is not growing. It has no leaders. It has no accountability. Nobody's responsible. Every group is autonomous. They're unwilling to address serious issues that arise in the fellowship. And it dawned on me, as a person who studies business cycles and business corporations, that here's an organization that's on its way to demise. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a learning organization. And I started trying to repeat some of the things I've said in this interview to leadership in Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was no interest whatsoever. I asked at one of the forums, for those of you who are deep into the 12 concepts of how Alcoholics Anonymous is ruled, what is the renewal process? I said, you know, whatever else Bill Wilson's faults were, Bill Wilson had an incredible interest in how to motivate people to get sober. For example, in the 1960s, he authored 3 pamphlets, wrote them to AA physicians over a period of years, participated in studies on using niacin to overcome the cravings for alcohol and as a cure for depression.
Right.
And I'd experimented with niacin on my own because of a nutritionist, not because of I knew about Bill Wilson's experiment, and it did help me overcome cravings. And for a period of time, I was able to moderate somewhat my drinking. Wilson was censored by the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous for doing the experiments with niacin. I was told to move all the niacin correspondence out of AA headquarters and to cease to do it. At the same time, thanks to Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary and some other pioneers in experimenting with psychedelic drugs. This is before LSD became an illegal substance. Bill participated many times in using LSD to see if he could have a spiritual experience. And lo and behold, his report was that the taking of LSD resulted in the same type of spiritual experience he'd had in the Towns Hospital in his 4th treatment in late 1934. And he thought it was a wonderful drug, and he started encouraging other people to take it to have a spiritual experience and overcome their alcoholism. Of course, he was severely criticized for doing that by the leadership in AA. So we have an organization that worships a founder as a saint, but they aren't willing to learn anything new about what science has learned about addiction and ways to overcome addiction. Has no interest in developing new therapies, has no interest in medications. It's become it's almost as if the medicine called Alcoholics Anonymous has actually become a poison to recovery. We've gone from being of tremendous assistance to people to probably being inimical to recovery. What do I mean about that? Well, when Bill Wilson first took the 6 steps of the Oxford group and turned them into the 12 steps, the first draft said, we admitted we were licked and our lives had become unmanageable. And because licked didn't sound so good, he changed it to powerless. And we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. Well, that's going on to become, I'm powerless over everything. And when you're powerless over everything, including your own behavior, you are engaged in a pretty dysfunctional philosophical problem, because you end up with a whole bunch of people who says, you know, I can't control my behavior. And the principles of democracy, the principles of Christianity, the principles of Western culture are you are responsible for your behavior. And so we've got 2 million people and being indoctrinated around the world today, so you're not responsible for your behavior because you're an alcoholic. And then, contrary to what Bill Wilson had said always, there are 2 pamphlets still available from AA World Services. One an address to the New York Medical Society, the second addressed to Catholic bishops, in which Bill Wilson said emphatically, Alcoholics Anonymous will never say that alcoholism is a disease. That is an outside issue. It is not something we're competent to judge on, and we don't think it is a disease. Marty Mann, Bill Wilson's sponsee, a very articulate, very impassioned, maybe the most articulate speaker we ever had in AA, decided that she wanted to remove the stigma of alcoholism, and she thought by calling it a disease that would remove the stigma. Unfortunately, it's not done that. But now, even though the official position of AA is we don't know what it is, every member of Alcoholics Anonymous in the world will tell you they have a disease. And it's a spiritual disease of which there is nothing in the medical lexicons that there is such a phenomenon. And it's used as an excuse to explain away why I was engaged in irresponsible behavior. Drinking to excess is behavior. I've heard people in rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous say, well, what did you expect from me? I'm an alcoholic. I'm possessed by alcoholic thinking. No, you're not. You're behaving like a criminal, and you have power to stop that, and you should face the consequences if you don't. So fundamental Christianity is being violated by that. The American criminal justice system is being violated by that, and human decency is being violated by that.
Anyway, okay.
Alcoholics Anonymous has been declining overseas rather rapidly in the last few years. I think that's because the world is becoming a much more secular. One of the reasons AA succeeded in America is these cyclical missionary movements we have, evangelical movements we've had throughout American history, thanks to our Puritan backgrounds, which makes the spiritual approach to overcoming addiction so appealing. It's also embedded in American psychology. One of the books Bill Wilson read during his last treatment was a book by William James called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and that was a book developed from lectures that William James, as the founder of American pragmatism, gave it in Edinburgh in 1901, 1902. And in talking about the varieties of religious experience, William James says what we found is that the cure for dipsomania is religiomania. Dipsomania was a term used at that time instead of alcoholism, and that was the only known way for people to recover. And that fits with the American missionary model, which is no longer prevalent in Europe. European people don't go to church anymore. Only about 10% of the people in Europe go to church. They've learned from centuries of warfare sponsored by the popes and kings who were had a divine right to rule.
Right.
That doesn't work, and so they being more secular have been attracted to the Alcoholics Anonymous approach, and even though it was pushed by the professional societies in those countries, the evidence is in just 9 years alone, by AAWS's official numbers, the number of members outside the United States declined by 27% over 9 years. So we're seeing it being rejected everywhere from Germany to Australia. And that's led to a rise in alternatives. For example, smart recovery, which is based on cognitive behavioral therapy principles and rational emotive behavioral principles, and short-term therapy for long-term results. They do not want you to be attending meetings after a year. They're run by professionals. Everyone who's a facilitator in SMART must be trained. They must be in charge of the meeting, and they're responsible for making sure that no one there is abused or given bad advice.
Do they have a sexual harassment policy, SMART?
Yes. Smart Recovery is very adamant that if abusive behavior is going on, the responsibility of the facilitator is to report it to law enforcement.
Are the leaders in Alcoholics Anonymous, someone who leads a meeting, are they trained, are they facilitators?
No.
Are they professionally run?
Every meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous is run by someone with at least 90 days of sobriety, and that's all they know is what they've been indoctrinated to in the rooms of AA. In the old days, in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, you were told we do not engage in relationships inside the rooms, and we treat the women with respect as people who are trying to recover. And when the hordes of people started coming in, that type of private kind of getting women aside and saying, be careful, we have people here who are whose main interest is not in being sober but trying to get into your pants. Those type of people somehow disappeared in the rooms. What I began seeing by the time in 1983, when I moved to Washington, D.C. area and belonged to a sober club where lots of military young women were showing up. There were guys who were serial sexual harassment experts. There were multiple men there who were not particularly great looking, but they had a long time sobriety. And AA, all you have to do to be worshipped is to have a lot of sobriety. Even if it's not true, you just say, I got 30 years, and everybody says, wow, awesome, you've been touched by God, and this made you a very worthy human being. And guys have used that to abuse younger women consistently. I was quite frankly shocked to see it. And then, I managed to get in groups where those things weren't going on, and I get on the board of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in 2009, we got a letter from someone in California saying this sort of abuse, predatory abuse, has to be stopped, and I want to know what positions Alcoholics Anonymous has on it. And I learned we don't have a position. Every group is autonomous. We take no responsibility for those things at all, and we're not going to speak out about it. I did some research, and I saw that the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous in Australia had adopted a position statement on harassment, including thievery from other members, borrowing money from other people, abusing people financially, abusing people sexually, abusing people verbally, and they posted it, made it a part of their meetings. Turns out the same thing had happened in the General Service Board of Great Britain. I gave those statements and position papers to members of the AAWS board, and nothing ever happened. There were women on the General Service Board at the time. One of them had a history of being abused by members of her family sexually, who said something needed to be done to address problems of people who faced incest. Another woman who was very active in AA wrote several pieces anonymously for the grapevine saying something had to be done about sexual harassment in Alcoholics Anonymous. We had to take a stand. She got, rather than warm accolades for doing that, she got threats.
Wow, what kind of threats did she get, and from where?
My best understanding is that she, even though she wrote the articles anonymously, she got letters or phone calls saying, we know who you are.
And what does that mean? We know who you are. I'm going to come and, wow. Is that a spiritual program going to come and get you? Huh?
Yes, it's not a very spiritual program, and it's, unfortunately, it's, because Alcoholics Anonymous' rooms are now full of people from the criminal justice system. The AA view is like the Oxford group. Once you've joined our organization, you're a changed human being. And unfortunately, and while the redemptive view of the power of religion is to be cherished, the truth is a lot of people don't change, and there are people there who are there to abuse other people. In my own area here in town, we have a person who chairs meetings regularly, who's never been able to get sober. He's fathered multiple children in town for which he's not responsible. He's ripped off trusting long-term sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous to the tunes of thousands of dollars. I know one person in the valley here who's been ripped off by another member to the tune of $30,000.
Wow.
And the view is we don't report people like that.
Why not?
It's some sort of ingrained culture that says they're not really responsible. That's what alcoholics do, or you know, I don't want to tarnish the organization by reporting somebody for doing things that are unacceptable.
When I first got sober, there's a phrase said every time called what you hear here and who you hear here, let it stay here.
Yes.
It was not said in the 70s. It's said all the time now. Is that said
Yeah.
here
Yes.
in meetings here?
We hear that often, you know. We treat ourselves as, rather than an anonymous organization, we treat ourselves as a secret organization. And we don't report on members, and we choose not to look at abusive behavior and do anything about it. Nobody takes responsibility for saying you may not chair meetings.
When did it push you over the edge to leave? What happened that you left and got involved so with SMART?
The wake-up call was serving those 4 years on the General Service Board. After the meeting with that Saturday on the General Service Board, when I asked the question, what is the process for renewal, and there was silence in the room, I knew this was not an organization that was interested in renewing itself, not interested in new approaches. I was so dismayed by that experience that I concluded, there's either two courses. One of them is to go back to my hometown and demonstrate to people how you really help other people get sober, or to quit. So I had sponsees, and I decided, well, I'll make the best effort possible to use what I've learned to see if we can renew Alcoholics Anonymous and show people how really to get sober.
Right.
And I engaged very intensely in that. I'm known as the most aggressive 12-stepper in this area. And what I discovered was what I had suspected all along. This is not a good way to get sober. Unfortunately, in 12 years, a small town with a Alcoholics Anonymous membership of around 100, I have seen 20 people who were members of Alcoholics Anonymous die or commit suicide. Some of them are sober as long as 15 years, die of drug overdoses, self-inflicted. Some commit suicide who just could not live with the problems that were still ongoing in their heads. Who were afraid to seek additional help because they've been told, God will eventually, if you do the fourth and fifth step correctly, God will fix you. And I was working with some young men who, one in particular that I had worked with for 7 years, trying to help him get sober and taking him to AA meetings. My wife and I put him through a Salvation Army treatment center, and long story short, he died a tragic death. I concluded there has to be a better alternative.
And so what did you find?
So I started doing research. I read innumerable books. I ordered all the material from Life Ring. I ordered all of Jack Trempey's material. I looked at every known recovery program that had been tried, and I did correspondence with Stanton Peel, the psychologist and attorney in New Jersey. Looked at Stanton's life process recovery plan. I evaluated all those. I worked with the local criminal justice system, local mental health people, local physicians, and we concluded that the best approach was a medication-assisted treatment approach that I've described, combined with smart recovery. And that's what we launched here.
So you went through some kind of training with SMART?
I went through 6 weeks of facilitator training with SMART, read all the material, corresponded with SMART facilitators in other parts of the country, and launched just over a year ago, launched the 7th SMART recovery meeting in the state of Colorado, and the only one on the western slope of the state. And
how's it going?
Because I've had some experience as a business person, as a manager, and some experience in public relations. I got the paper to do a story about what we were going to do, and 23 people showed up at the first meeting.
Wow.
And the parole officer for this region, and the probation officers for this region, the mental health officials for this region all send their people now to Smart Recovery instead of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people who've never been able to stay sober in AA, between working with the physicians here who are now trained in uses of naltrexone and the other medications, we're seeing those people finally get sober.
Mm-hmm.
And you know,
great.
some of the basic learned lessons of all the 12-step work, and now the work with medications and the work with new psychological techniques, is that, you know, the only people who are going to get sober are those who are motivated to get sober.
Mm-hmm.
Coerced people are not going to get sober. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have to make a decision to get sober.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just very basic. Deciding to become a sober, non-addicted person is a decision. Staying sober is a choice. It's not one day at a time. It's making a decision. I have made a decision, and I said this long ago in Alcoholics Anonymous. I made a decision. Alcohol has done all the damage to me and those around me. I'm never going to let it happen. I'm going to go to my grave a sober person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's with me every single day. I'm around alcohol and
Mm-hmm.
free alcohol in my rooms on cruise ships and
Right.
every place else. I've never been tempted to drink, and I ain't going to drink, and I don't have to have meetings in a church basement. I'd like to go to, you know, if I'm going to go to church, I'd like to go in the carpeted portion. You know, if I want to be in a fundamentalist religion, I will, you know, I'll just go to the church sanctuary. I won't have to go to the basement. You know, making a decision to quit, improving your health, improving the thinking process is the way to get sober, to stay sober.
Alcoholics Anonymous has just made videos that's targeting young people, and which is underage minors, and we know that from the stories we're collecting that third-level sex offenders are being sentenced to Alcoholics Anonymous at the same time. What?
Well, I would advise anyone who's young people or otherwise, especially women, if you're considering attending a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, first go online and look at the photos of the sexual predators that are on the websites of most sheriffs, and you will just frequently discover that the sex offenders have been sentenced by the courts to show up in AA meetings, at least a certain number of meetings a week. And just be aware that you're not going in because they're meeting in a church basement does not mean you're around safe people. It's just, you know, some AA groups are as safe as the best churches in America, and some are not, and it's just very difficult to know which ones those are. Alcoholics Anonymous should come with a warning label today. You may get ripped off. You may get sexually exploited. Someone may love bomb you and cherish you and make you feel extremely special. Like I know in one case here in town where that love bombing resulted, even the woman was being helped have a place to live. It turned out the individual, both wife and husband, who were being so kind to her in Alcoholics Anonymous, both of them were sexually abusing her son.
Wow.
7-year-old son.
Oh my God.
And they were using that.
Did he go to jail? Did they press charges?
No, she just died of, this woman unfortunately just died of brain cancer.
Oh my God.
She had lung cancer.
Oh my God. Wow. You've read a lot of books. This film is hopefully going to be seen by a lot of people. What is your favorite, if somebody's been in and out and it's not worked, AA, what is their favorite book that you would say, read this book?
I think my favorite book at the moment would be The Cure for Alcoholism by Dr. Escapa. It's available on Amazon for about $10. That describes the Sinclair method of using naltrexone 1 hour before you drink, and resulting in pharmacological extinction in a period of 3 to 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
Well described online if you Google the Sinclair method. The upcoming book that I think is going to be the blockbuster is by Dr. Bankole Johnson, head of neurosciences, University of Virginia. It's called The Rehab Myth. It'll be out on Amazon in July of 2013. There are copies already of early drafts circulating already. Dr. Johnson is one of the premier researchers in the new medications. He's already written editorials in the Washington Post and other places saying that rehabs don't work, Alcoholics Anonymous does not work. 3 chapters of the book are devoted to saying why AA does not work, why these celebrities like Lindsay Lohan keep going through treatment centers and it not working. He describes why that doesn't work, and he shows the efficacy of the medication approach. He describes case studies of individuals in language that people can understand. There are other books that are out there that are available. There's books like Sober for Life. There's a book like Amy Lee Coy's a book about discovering after multiple rehabs and awful experiences with drugs and alcohol, she was able to devise her own program for getting sober.
Mm-hmm.
And my suggestion would be exhaust, before you go to Alcoholics Anonymous or before you go to 28-day rehab, look into the medication approaches, look into the personal experience of people who found ways to do it without having to commit the rest of your life to a fundamentalist religious subcult that's going to absorb a lot of your time and may be a risk to your sanity and
Mm-hmm.
safety.
I know you're not a parent, but there are a lot of parents that are sending their kids to rehab right now. Betty Ford is advertising in Los Angeles for youth. What would you say to a parent who's having problems with their child or their teen right now? I know you're not an expert on it, but I just want your take.
Well, first of all, because so many parents are traumatized by the thought that their children are going to become lifetime addicts and alcoholics, I would caution people that just because a kid comes home drunk does not mean they're an alcoholic and does not mean they're going to spend their whole life abusing themselves and die young. They should consult a non-12-step counselor and talk about short-term therapies, support for children. Rehab is not a decent place for kids. Most of them do not separate out young people from older adults. Indoctrinating people into heretical religious indoctrinations like Betty Ford and Hazelden do is probably not healthy for children. Teaching kids they're powerless over drugs and alcohol is the opposite of what they should be teaching. Mm-hmm. If there is evidence that the kid is getting in trouble with the law or things like that, then I would suggest professional counseling from therapists that are not in the 12-step movement. I would specifically search out counselors who know how to use cognitive behavioral therapy as described by Dr. Beck. There's books available called...
Does SMART have an aspect of their program for family?
SMART has several young people's groups, and that's one of the things that's being worked on pretty aggressively is devising additional young people's groups. Many of the counselors and facilitators in SMART Recovery are trained to work with young people.
Right.
So rather than being terribly alarmed, the first approach would be seek out rational emotive behavioral therapy. There's a list on the Albert Ellis Institute in New York City. There's a list of REBT counselors in every state of the union. Most major cities have multiple ones. Cognitive behavioral therapists frequently advertise that they do that. And after you've tried all those approaches, then maybe some sort of visit to a physician if the kid is truly addicted to drugs and alcohol to learn about some of the new medication approaches. They frequently can help people who have withdrawal issues and people who have cravings. But for the most part, someone 13 years old is probably not to be diagnosed as a alcoholic in the first stages of a progression that's going to lead them to spend the rest of their life in prison or the grave. You know, we're scared to death of youthful experimentation. And we need to tell parents that there are other alternatives out there rather than Minnesota model that's practiced by Betty Ford and all of the other treatment centers in America.
Is finally, I mean, there's just going to be somebody sitting in the theater watching this. Anything that you want to say that I haven't asked you or you haven't already said? Is there something you would just like to say to the people out there? That
If I had 30 years to live over again, I would hope that what I have been able to share is about new approaches that had been available to me.
Yeah.
I've wasted a lot of time, a lot of effort, which does not dismay me, but I have wasted a lot of time in my own recovery, and wasted a lot of other people's time in their recovery with things that don't work. And I now know what works. I now know that you know, sobriety is a decision. You know, not drinking is not one day at a time. Not drinking is a choice, and I'm encouraged by the openness I see in the young counselors who are coming out of academic schools. I'm encouraged by the development of alternatives. I'm tremendously inspired by organizations like SMART that say if you're here after a year, you know, you've probably spent too much time with us. Get on with your life.
Yeah.
Bill Wilson wrote an essay in the Grapevine in 1959 which said, "Dear members, we've all done pretty well at staying off the booze. I think the next frontier is emotional sobriety." Everybody was excited about that, but AA never did anything about teaching people how to live a balanced emotional life. They taught them how to spend a lot of time endlessly going to 2.5 meetings a week, which is what the average member does in AA today. And in 2009 and 10, the Grapevine published a book. It was just a collection of essays called Emotional Sobriety. It sold 19,000 copies in the first few months, showing a tremendous hunger in the membership of AA for something called emotional sobriety.
Right.
Matter of fact, it was the hottest bestseller in AA history for a book that was not authored by Bill Wilson.
Wow.
They've now come out with emotional sobriety too. You know, as their cognitive behavioral therapy and the most efficacious treatments suggested in there? No, they aren't.
Oh, it's going yellow. One quick question. Maybe it's not quick. I'll have to plug it in. What helped you deprogram and deal
Well, I
with?
would give a lot of credit to, number one, my college professor who acquainted me with, in studying philosophy. He encouraged me to study the religious philosophers, and that was how I learned about the Oxford movement, the social gospel, and what's wrong with that why it's heretical from a Christian standpoint. And secondly, I would thank Orange at orangepapers.org for the insights he gave me into what's wrong with Alcoholics Anonymous and its approaches. I began reading that about 10 years ago, and got inspired to do additional research and saw that what Terry has put on the Orange Papers and has extreme validity and gets more hits today every month than the AA.org website does. 2 million a month or something like that.
Oh my God.
Shows that we are on the cusp of a transformation in America. At the same time, Alcoholics Anonymous is very quietly in decline and dependent upon coercion to attract its new members. There is going to be a burst forward and new approaches to treating alcoholism in this country. It's a quiet underground river. At some point, it's going to burst to the surface, and everybody's going to say, "My God, there are alternatives. There are medications out there. There are decent short-term therapies that work." And those people are going to collect together in new support groups that are short-term in approach. It's sort of like these movements, social movements that spring from nowhere. I view it kind of like Rosa Parks sitting on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and saying, "I don't think I'm going to move to the back of the bus. I'm not going to give my seat to a white man."
Right.
And that's what's probably going to happen. Is somebody going to stand up and say, "No, Judge, I am not going to allow you to sentence me to Alcoholics Anonymous." The case is going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to make the decision, regardless if they're conservatives or liberals in the court. The Supreme Court is going to do what the Ninth Circuit in federal courts have done, and the Second Circuit federal courts have done, and other state courts have done, which is to say Alcoholics Anonymous is a religious organization, and sentencing people there is a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And at that point, Alcoholics Anonymous is going to lose its chief feed system, and we will allow America to take the same approach the Europeans are taking to finding short-term solutions to these problems.
I want to thank you so much for this interview. I mean, meeting you, I'm so grateful to Ilsa from Stinkin' Thinking to introducing me to you, because it made me feel so sane. Just the emails at first, and to finally talk with you on the phone, and I really, really appreciate this interview. It's
Delighted to be a part of bringing a little sanity to the alcoholism treatment.
Yeah, I'm going to really need the help in California.